William Pierce heard it first, a sound that didn't belong in the Apollo Theater's basement, where he'd been cleaning for over 4 decades. Not the usual rumble of subway trains beneath Harlem's streets, not the echo of rehearsals bleeding through the old walls. This was different. Raw, guttural, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop because you know, instantly, that someone's world is collapsing. It was 2:47 in the morning, and the building should have been empty. The show had ended 6 hours ago. The crowds were long gone, but as William descended those basement stairs with his mop bucket, the sound grew louder, more desperate, more utterly broken. And when he finally turned the corner and saw who was making that sound, his blood ran cold. Because the man sitting there in the shadows, hunched over like his spine had given up, was the last person on earth he ever expected to find destroyed. The invincible James Brown. And what came next would change everything William thought he knew about strength, about performance, about the price of being a legend. Before we continue with this story, if you appreciate untold stories of music legends, please subscribe to our channel. New documentaries every week. The Apollo Theater basement in 1971 wasn't like the polished museum exhibit it would become decades later. It was a labyrinth of concrete corridors, rusted pipes that sweated in summer and froze in winter, and rooms filled with forgotten stage equipment from shows that had made history. William Pierce knew every inch of this underground world. He'd started working at the Apollo in 1928, when he was just 17 years old. And over 43 years, he'd become as much a part of the building's foundation as the concrete itself. The basement held the Apollo's secrets, and William was its silent keeper. But nothing in those 4 decades had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The sound that drew him down those stairs that March night wasn't just crying. It was the kind of weeping that comes from somewhere so deep inside a person that it feels like their soul is trying to escape through their throat. William had heard grief before. He'd heard disappointment. He'd heard the exhausted sobs of performers who'd given everything on stage and had nothing left for themselves. But this was different. This sound carried weight that seemed to press down on the very air itself. James Brown's reputation in 1971 was untouchable. The man they called the Godfather of Soul, the hardest working man in show business, had revolutionized American music. He'd taken rhythm and blues and twisted it into something entirely new, something that would later be called funk. And his work ethic was legendary, almost superhuman. He performed over 300 nights a year. He demanded perfection from everyone around him because he understood that excellence was the only weapon against a world that wanted to diminish him. The James Brown that audiences saw was invincible. He'd spin across stages in splits that would cripple ordinary men. He'd scream and sweat and give every ounce of energy he possessed, and then somehow find more. The famous cape routine, where he'd collapse in apparent exhaustion only to throw off the cape and launch back into performance, had become theatrical legend. People came to see James Brown to witness something beyond normal human capability. They came to see a man who seemed to have conquered every limitation, every obstacle, every force that tried to hold him down. But William Pierce wasn't seeing that man in the basement. He was seeing someone else entirely. William's hands shook slightly as he gripped his mop bucket, the sound of that broken weeping pulling him forward even as every instinct told him to turn back. The basement stairs of the Apollo were steep and narrow, worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. The single bulb that usually lit the stairwell had burned out weeks ago. William's flashlight beam bounced with each step, casting wild shadows on the graffitied walls where musicians had left their marks over the years. The weeping grew louder as he descended. But as he turned into the eastern corridor, the one that ran parallel to 125th Street directly above, the sound crystallized. It was coming from the furnace room. William's heart hammered against his ribs. Nobody ever went into the furnace room this late. The building had been locked tight since midnight. Security had done their rounds. Whoever was in that furnace room had either hidden there during closing or had a key that shouldn't exist. William pushed open the furnace room door slowly, its hinges shrieking in protest. The room beyond was vast and hot despite the March chill outside. The air tasted like rust and coal dust and something else, something human and desperate. And there, in the corner farthest from the door, curled against the wall where the foundation met the floor, was James Brown. But not the James Brown that William had seen on stage just hours earlier. Not the man who'd commanded the Apollo's audience with the absolute authority of someone who owned not just the stage, but the entire concept of performance itself. This James Brown wore the same purple suit he'd performed in, but now it was stained dark with sweat and tears. His processed hair, usually immaculate, hung limp and disheveled. His famous sunglasses lay broken on the floor beside him, one lens completely shattered. But it was his face that stopped William's breath. James Brown's face was destroyed by grief. His eyes were swollen nearly shut. Tears ran unchecked down his cheeks. His mouth hung open in that terrible way that happens when someone has cried so hard for so long that they've forgotten how to close it. For a long moment, William simply stood there, frozen in the doorway. His mind couldn't reconcile what his eyes were seeing. This couldn't be James Brown. James Brown didn't break. James Brown didn't cry. James Brown was strength personified. But the evidence was undeniable. The godfather of soul was shattered. William set down his mop bucket slowly, carefully, trying not to startle the broken man in front of him. The bucket made a small clang against the concrete floor, and James Brown's head snapped up. For a moment, their eyes met. And in that moment, William saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw absolute terror. Not fear of William himself, but fear of being seen. Fear of having the mask ripped away. Fear of being exposed as human when the world demanded he be superhuman. James Brown's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment, trying to form words, trying to explain. But no words came. Instead, a fresh wave of sobs overtook him, and he buried his face in his hands, his entire body convulsing with the force of his grief. Because he understood, in that instant, something profound about the nature of performance and the cost of being a legend. William took a step forward, then another. He moved slowly, the way you'd approach a wounded animal. When he was close enough, William did something that surprised even himself. He sat down on the floor next to James Brown, not across from him, not standing over him, but beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. And then William Pierce, who'd spent 43 years being invisible in a building full of stars, simply waited. It took almost 10 minutes before James Brown could speak. When the words finally came, they emerged broken and raw, barely louder than a whisper. The story that unfolded in that basement room, told in fragments between sobs and silences, was one that would never appear in any biography, never make it to any interview, never become part of the official James Brown narrative. It was too real, too painful, too human for the myth that the world needed him to be. The performance that night had been extraordinary, but something had broken inside James during that performance. Something that had been cracking for years finally gave way completely. As he looked out at those thousands of faces, all of them screaming his name, all of them demanding more and more and more, he'd felt something shift in his chest. These people didn't love James Brown the man. They loved James Brown the performance. They loved the myth, the machine, the superhuman being who could do things they couldn't do. And the real James Brown, the one who got tired and scared and lonely and sad, had nowhere to exist. After the show, he'd gone through all the normal motions. He'd talked to the promoters. He'd signed autographs. He'd been James Brown, capital J, capital B, the brand, the business, the unstoppable force. But inside, something was screaming. Something was breaking. William listened as James talked about the Cape routine, that famous bit of theater that had become his signature. Most people thought it was just showmanship, a clever way to build drama and keep the audience engaged. But James revealed something that night that nobody knew. The Cape routine wasn't an act, or rather, it started as an act but had become something else entirely. Every night, when James collapsed on stage, when his band members draped that cape over his shoulders, when he pretended to be too exhausted to continue, he wasn't entirely pretending. In those moments, he genuinely wanted to quit. He genuinely wanted to walk away. He genuinely wanted to let the cape cover him completely and never come back up. No matter how tired, no matter how empty, no matter how much it cost him, the cape had become a metaphor for his entire life. The weight of expectations, the burden of representation, the exhausting demand to be superhuman every single moment of every single day. And on this particular night, after this particular performance, the weight had finally become too much to bear. James talked about his childhood in Barnwell, South Carolina, about being abandoned by his mother when he was just 4 years old, about growing up in poverty so extreme that it felt like a physical presence, about learning early that the only way to survive was to be tougher, smarter, harder working than everyone else, about building walls around the scared little boy inside and presenting to the world a man who couldn't be hurt, couldn't be broken, couldn't be stopped, and about how those walls had worked. They'd carried him from Barnwell to the Apollo, from poverty to wealth, from nobody to the godfather of soul. But walls built to keep pain out also keep connection out. And tonight, James Brown felt more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. James had been performing over 300 shows a year for nearly a decade, and the human body and mind aren't designed for that kind of sustained intensity. Something has to give. And what had been giving, slowly and invisibly, was James Brown's ability to feel anything real at all. He'd become so good at performing emotion on stage that he'd forgotten how to actually experience it. Joy, anger, sadness, love, all of it had become theatrical. All of it had become part of the show. Until tonight, when something genuine had broken through, and the flood of real emotion had been so overwhelming that it had destroyed him. The tears weren't just about exhaustion or loneliness or the weight of expectations. They were about loss. Loss of self. Loss of authenticity. Loss of any clear boundary between James Brown, the performer, and James Brown, the person. He'd given so much to the world that there was nothing left for himself. Every ounce of energy, every moment of creativity, every spark of genuine feeling had been poured into his music, his shows, his mission to prove that a poor black kid from South Carolina could be the best performer in the world. And he'd succeeded. But the cost had been everything inside himself that wasn't performance. William Pierce sat beside James Brown in that basement for 3 hours. 3 hours of tears, confessions and silences so heavy they felt like physical objects. 3 hours of watching the most powerful performer in American music reveal himself as achingly, devastatingly human. And in those 3 hours, something shifted in William too. He'd spent 4 decades being invisible at the Apollo. But sitting there beside James Brown, William realized that he'd been seeing the truth all along. All these performers, all these legends, they were just people. People with gifts, yes. People with extraordinary talent and drive. But still just people, carrying their own wounds, fighting their own battles, struggling with their own humanity. When James finally ran out of words, when the tears finally slowed, a different kind of silence filled the furnace room. This wasn't the heavy silence of grief. It was something gentler, something that felt almost like peace. William stood up slowly, his knees protesting after 3 hours on a concrete floor. He extended his hand to James, who looked at it for a long moment before taking it. William helped him to his feet, and for just a moment, they stood there facing each other. The janitor and the superstar. 2 men who just shared something that transcended every social boundary that 1971 America tried to enforce. William picked up the broken sunglasses from the floor and handed them to James, who accepted them with a nod. Then William retrieved his mop bucket, and together they walked out of the furnace room, through the maze of basement corridors, up the narrow stairs, and into the main backstage area of the Apollo Theater. At the stage door, James paused. The first hints of dawn were creeping over Harlem, painting the streets in shades of gray and gold. In a few hours, the city would wake up. In a few hours, James Brown would need to be the godfather of soul again. But for this moment, in this suspended time between night and day, he was just a man who'd broken and been witnessed, and somehow survived it. He looked at William one more time, and in his eyes was something that went beyond gratitude. It was recognition. A silent promise that what had happened in that basement would stay in that basement. Not because it was shameful, but because it was sacred. William watched James disappear into a waiting car, and then he went back inside to finish his shift. He mopped the floors, he cleaned the dressing rooms, He did all the things he'd been doing for 43 years. But something was different. He'd been given a gift that night. He'd been trusted with the truth of a legend. He'd been allowed to see behind the cape. And that trust changed everything about how he understood his place in the world. In the weeks and months that followed, William would see James Brown perform at the Apollo several more times. And each time, he'd watch the cape routine with new eyes. He'd see the moment when James collapsed, when the band members draped that heavy cape over his shoulders. And William would understand, in its way that nobody else in the audience could understand, what that struggle really meant. He'd understand the genuine exhaustion beneath the theater. He'd understand the real desire to quit beneath the performance of quitting. He'd understand the enormous effort it took for James to throw off that cape and rise again, night after night after night. But William never told anyone what he'd witnessed in the basement. Not his wife, not his children, not the other Apollo staff members. Some moments are too important to share. Some truths are too profound to be reduced to stories. What happened between William Pierce and James Brown on that March night in 1971 was a moment of pure humanity, unfiltered and raw. And William understood that his job wasn't to reveal it, but to protect it. Decades would pass before William Pierce would finally share this story. And even then, he'd only tell it once, to a documentary filmmaker who'd spent years earning his trust. By then, James Brown had passed away. The godfather of soul had died on Christmas Day 2006, and the world had mourned the loss of a legend. But William mourned the loss of the man he'd sat beside in a basement. The man who'd been allowed, for just a few hours, to be human. The man who'd cried until he had no tears left, and then somehow found the strength to put the mask back on. William was 93 years old when he finally told this story. His hands shook as he spoke, not from age, but from the weight of memory. Even after all those years, the moment remained vivid. He could still hear the sound of James Brown's crying echoing off those basement walls. He could still feel the weight of sitting beside someone whose entire world had collapsed. He could still remember the exact shade of orange from the boiler's pilot light, the exact smell of coal dust and desperation. The documentary filmmaker asked William why he'd kept the secret for so long. William's answer was simple: because some things are more important than money or fame. Some things are sacred. And what he'd witnessed that night was James Brown at his most human, most vulnerable, most real. To exploit that would have been a betrayal, not just of James, but of something fundamental about what it means to witness another person's pain. The cape routine would continue to be James Brown's signature for the rest of his career. He'd perform it thousands more times. It would become so iconic that people who'd never seen a full James Brown show would still know about the cape. But William Pierce would always know the deeper truth. The cape wasn't just showmanship. It was autobiography. It was metaphor made visible. It was James Brown's way of performing his own struggle night after night, for audiences who came to see strength, but who were actually witnessing something far more profound. Every time James collapsed under the weight of that cape, he was genuinely collapsing. Every time he struggled to rise, he was genuinely struggling. And every time he threw off the cape and launched back into performance, he was making a choice. A choice to continue. A choice to give more. A choice to carry the weight even when it felt impossible. The cape routine was the story of James Brown's entire life, compressed into 3 minutes of theater. And the audiences who cheered for it had no idea how real it actually was. William understood something else too. By witnessing James Brown's breakdown that night, by sitting beside him in silence, by accepting his humanity without judgment, William had given James a gift that few people in his life could give. For those 3 hours in the basement, James Brown didn't have to be the godfather of soul. He didn't have to be invincible or perfect or superhuman. He could just be a man who was tired and overwhelmed. And that permission, that simple acceptance of his humanity, had been enough to help him find the strength to put the mask back on. William Pierce died in 2024 at the age of 113, just 3 months after finally telling the story. In his final interview, William reflected on what that night had taught him about performance, about humanity, about the price we pay for being who the world needs us to be. The lesson wasn't just about James Brown. It was about all of us. Everyone performs. Everyone wears masks. Everyone carries weights that nobody else can see. The difference between James Brown and the rest of us was only a matter of scale. His performance was on the world's biggest stages. His mask had to be perfect under the harshest spotlights. But the fundamental human experience was the same. We all collapse sometimes. We all need moments to be simply human. William's final words in that interview were about the sound. That terrible, beautiful, devastating sound he'd heard echoing up from the Apollo basement on a March night in 1971. A sound of pure, unfiltered human pain. A sound that reminded him that beneath every legend is a person. Beneath every superhuman performance is a human being. And sometimes, the most important thing we can do for each other is simply witness that humanity without demanding that the performance continue when the person inside needs to rest. The Apollo Theater still stands in Harlem. The basement still exists, though it's been renovated. The furnace room where William found James Brown is now a storage area. There's no physical trace of what happened there on that March night. But William Pierce's testimony ensures that the moment won't be forgotten. Somewhere in the foundation of one of America's most historic theaters is a memory of the night the godfather of soul took off his cape and couldn't find the strength to put it back on, and of the janitor who sat beside him until he could. That's the real story behind the cape. That's the truth beneath the legend. James Brown gave the world everything he had. He revolutionized music. He inspired millions. He proved that greatness was possible regardless of where you started. But he paid for that greatness with pieces of himself that could never be recovered. And on one night in one basement, he allowed one person to see the price, to witness the cost, to understand that the man who seemed invincible was actually just incredibly, impossibly, courageously willing to keep standing, even when everything inside him wanted to fall.